She was the biggest movie star in America. Men wanted her, women wanted to be her, and every hair salon in the country was selling out of bleach because millions of women were trying to copy her look. She was 26 years old, she was about to get married to the love of her life, and she was making more money in a single week than most families earned in an entire year. And then, one afternoon, on a movie set in Hollywood, she couldn't catch her breath. She was sweating, she was shaking, and she could barely stand up. The doctors came and looked at her and said it was nothing serious. Just the flu, maybe a bad gallbladder. Everybody figured she'd be back on set in a few days. She was dead in less than 3 weeks. And the thing is, she'd actually been dying for years. Nobody knew it. Not her, not her doctors, not the studio that depended on her, not the man who loved her. Because the thing that killed Jean Harlow didn't start on that movie set in 1937. It started when she was 15 years old, with what everyone thought was just a childhood sickness. Something she got over and moved on from. Except she didn't get over it. Not really. Her body just hid it from her for over a decade while it slowly destroyed her from the inside. This is the story of how the original blonde bombshell, the woman who basically invented everything we think of when we picture Hollywood glamour, was taken by something so slow and so quiet that by the time anyone figured out what was happening, there was nothing left to do. Kansas City, 1911. Harlene Harlow Carpenter was born on March 3rd into a comfortable, well-off family. Her father, Montclair Carpenter, was a dentist with a successful practice. Her mother, Jean Harlow Carpenter, came from money. Her grandfather on her mother's side was a real estate man who owned property all over the area, including a big 25-room house in Bonner Springs, Kansas, where the family spent their summers. So little Harlene grew up with everything a child could want. Nice houses, good schools, a family that doted on her. Everyone called her the baby, a nickname that started in the cradle and stuck with her for the rest of her life. She was so used to being called the baby that she didn't even know her real name was Harlene until she was 5 years old and showed up at Miss Barstow's school, and the teachers started using it. She came home confused, asking her mother who this Harlean person was. But underneath all that comfort, things were not good between her parents. Her mother had been married off young by her own father, and she resented it. She was beautiful, she was restless, and she had dreams, big dreams. She wanted to be an actress. She wanted Hollywood. And her husband, the quiet Kansas City dentist, was not part of that picture. So in 1922, when Harlene was about 11, her parents divorced, and her mother packed up and took her daughter out to Los Angeles. Now here's where you need to understand something about Harlene's mother, because she's one of the most important figures in this whole story. Everyone called her Mama Jean or Mother Jean, and she was a force of nature. She was ambitious, she was controlling, and she was absolutely determined to make it in the movie business. But there was a problem. She was already in her 30s by the time she got to Hollywood, and in the 1920s that was considered too old to start as a starlet. Studios wanted teenagers and women in their early 20s. So Mama Jean's dreams of acting died almost the moment she arrived. And what happened next is something you see over and over again with parents who have dreams that don't work out. She started pouring all of that energy, all of that ambition, all of that frustrated hunger onto her daughter. Harlene was going to be the star that Mama Jean never got to be, whether Harlene wanted it or not. They bounced around for a while. Hollywood first, where Harlene attended the Hollywood School for Girls. Then back to the Midwest when things didn't pan out immediately. Mama Jean remarried a man named Marino Bello, who was charming and handsome, but also kind of shady. He was the type of guy who was always looking for an angle, always trying to figure out how to get his hands on money that wasn't his. He would eventually try to use Harlene's fame to line his own pockets, but that comes later. The family settled in Chicago for a stretch, and that's where Harlene went to high school. And that's also where something happened that nobody paid enough attention to at the time. At 15, Harlene came down with scarlet fever. Now, scarlet fever was common back then, and it was serious. But most kids recovered from it. Harlene did too. The fever broke, she got better, and everyone moved on. But what people didn't understand in the 1920s was that scarlet fever was caused by a specific type of bacteria. And in some people, that bacteria triggered a reaction where the body's own defenses turned against itself and started attacking the kidneys. The damage was slow. It was silent. There was absolutely no way to detect it with the medicine they had at that time. And that's exactly what happened to Harlene. The scarlet fever went away, but inside her body, her kidneys had been hurt. Not enough to make her feel sick right away, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough that they were slowly, gradually, quietly failing. A clock had started ticking, and nobody could hear it. At 16, Harlene did something that shocked everyone. She eloped with a young man named Charles McGrew, whose family had money. They moved out to Beverly Hills and set up a little house together, and for a while, it seemed like Harlene might just settle into being a wife. She actually wanted that. By most accounts, Harlene's real dream in life wasn't fame or stardom. It was to be a wife and a mother, to have a family, to live a normal, quiet life. But Mama Jean had followed her daughter to California, because of course she had, and she had very different plans. Mama Jean pushed Harlene toward the movies. Harlene's husband didn't want her acting. Her grandfather sided with the husband. But Mama Jean was relentless. She eventually helped break up the marriage. Some accounts say she actively worked to drive a wedge between Harlene and McGrew, undermining the relationship until it fell apart. And it did fall apart, after about a year and a half. Harlene found herself single, barely 17, living in Hollywood, and being steered toward a career she hadn't chosen and didn't particularly want. Her mother never let her see her father after the divorce, though Harlene would sneak visits with him throughout her life whenever she could manage it. She registered with Central Casting under her mother's maiden name, Jean Harlow, and just like that, at least on paper, the girl from Kansas City disappeared and a movie star was born. In reality, she was still just a kid picking up small parts, extra work, background roles that paid maybe $7 a day. She was obviously beautiful, with this incredible blonde hair that almost glowed on screen. But she was just one of hundreds, maybe thousands, of pretty young women trying to make it in Hollywood. The thing that changed everything was a man named Howard Hughes. Hughes was a young, eccentric billionaire who was pouring his fortune into making a massive war movie about fighter pilots called Hell's Angels. He'd been working on it for years. The original leading lady had a thick accent that didn't work now that the film was being converted from silent to sound. Someone recommended Harlene, and Hughes took one look at her and cast her. She was 18 years old. Hell's Angels premiered in 1930 at Grauman's Chinese Theater, and the crowd outside was estimated at 50,000 people. The movie got mixed reviews, and the critics were not kind to Harlene's acting. They basically said she was beautiful and nothing else, but none of that mattered. Audiences couldn't take their eyes off her. Hughes's publicity team started calling her the Platinum Blonde, and almost overnight, Jean Harlow became famous. Women all over America rushed to salons asking for that same silvery white hair. Sales of peroxide went through the roof. And about that hair. The platinum blonde look that made Jean famous wasn't natural, obviously. She maintained it with a mixture that included bleach, ammonia, and other harsh chemicals applied to her scalp every single week. It was painful. It damaged her hair. And over the years, it actually started to thin out badly. By the end of her life, she was wearing wigs because her real hair couldn't take it anymore. Some people later wondered if the chemicals had contributed to her death, but that turned out not to be the case. The real cause was something much older and much deeper. But the hair was part of the price she paid for fame, week after week, burning her scalp to maintain an image that millions of women were trying to copy. But early fame is a tricky thing. Hughes had made Jean famous, but he lost interest in managing her career after that. He loaned her out to other studios for parts that didn't show off anything beyond her looks. She showed up in James Cagney's The Public Enemy and a film literally called Platinum Blonde, but the roles were thin. The reviews were bad. People were starting to wonder if Jean Harlow was just a one-trick act, a pretty face with no real talent underneath. And then, in 1932, Hughes sold her contract to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer for $60,000. MGM was the biggest, most powerful studio in Hollywood, and they saw something in Jean that nobody else had bothered to look for. They cast her in a comedy called Red-Headed Woman, and suddenly this girl who everyone assumed could only stand there and look beautiful turned out to be genuinely, naturally funny. She had comic timing that couldn't be taught. She had this warmth and looseness on camera that made audiences feel like they knew her personally. She wasn't just the blonde bombshell anymore. She was a real actress. And the hits started coming fast. Red Dust with Clark Gable in 1932. Dinner at 8 in 1933, where she stole every scene she was in. Bombshell, which was basically a comedy about her own life, right down to the controlling mother and the sleazy stepfather. Hold Your Man. China Seas. Wife versus Secretary with Clark Gable, Myrna Loy, and a young James Stewart, who later said he deliberately messed up their kissing scene over and over so they'd have to reshoot it. Because in his words, Jean Harlow was a really good kisser. By the mid-1930s, her popularity had overtaken even MGM's other leading ladies, women like Joan Crawford, Greta Garbo, and Norma Shearer. She was making thousands of dollars a week during the Depression, when families were standing in bread lines. In 1935, she legally changed her name to Jean Harlow. The girl named Harleen was officially gone, and the thing about Jean that surprised everyone who actually met her was that she was nothing like her screen image. On camera, she played these tough, alluring, sharp-tongued women. But off-screen, she was shy, sweet, warm, and genuinely modest. She had no formal acting training at all. She learned everything on the job. She was a talented mimic who could do impressions of other stars like Mae West and Marlene Dietrich that would have the whole crew in stitches. She loved animals, especially dogs. She was a devoted Democrat who visited the White House and campaigned for Roosevelt. She read constantly, she was smart, and she wanted desperately for people to take her seriously as more than just a body and a hair color. During a salary dispute with MGM, she wrote a full novel called Today is Tonight. She said the story came to her almost complete in a dream. The book wasn't published during her lifetime, probably because the studio didn't want their blonde bombshell being seen as an intellectual. It finally came out in 1965, almost 30 years after her death. But while her career was soaring, her personal life was falling apart. And this is where things get really dark. In July 1932, Jean married Paul Byrne. He was an MGM executive, about 20 years older than her, and he had a reputation at the studio as one of the few genuinely decent people in a business that wasn't known for decency. He was quiet, intellectual, kind, the type of person that actors actually trusted with their problems when they were afraid to go to the studio bosses. And he seemed to genuinely care about Jean as a person, not just as a moneymaker. She was drawn to his intelligence. He saw her for who she really was underneath the bombshell image. 2 months after the wedding, on September 5, 1932, Byrne's butler found him unresponsive in their home with a serious injury. There was a note nearby that said, "Dearest dear, Unfortunately, this is the only way to make good the frightful wrong I have done you and to wipe out my abject humiliation. I love you, Paul. You understand that last night was only a comedy. His death was officially ruled as self-inflicted. But the circumstances were strange from the very beginning. MGM's studio executives and their fixers got to the house before the police did. Evidence may have been moved or altered. And then it came out that Byrne had a former common-law wife, a woman named Dorothy Millette, who he'd been secretly supporting financially for years while she was in and out of medical facilities for mental health issues. 2 days after Byrne died, Millette was found dead in the Sacramento River. She'd thrown herself off a riverboat. The studio quickly put out a story that Byrne had killed himself because of personal problems as a husband. They figured it was better for Jean's image if her husband had been troubled than if the real truth came out, which was that Byrne might actually have been murdered by Millette, and that his marriage to Jean might have technically been illegal because of his previous relationship. The whole thing was a mess, and the truth of what really happened that night is still debated almost a century later. Jean was 21 years old. She'd been married for 2 months, and instead of being allowed to grieve privately, she watched the most intimate details of her life get torn apart in every newspaper in America. She was even briefly suspected of involvement before that idea was dropped, but she survived it. She went quiet, went back to work, and somehow came out the other side even more popular than before. The actress Tallulah Bankhead, who'd been offered Jean's role in case the scandal destroyed her career, refused to take it and called the idea one of the shabbiest acts of all time. Bankhead wrote that damning a woman for someone else's misfortune would be unforgivable, and she told the studio boss as much to his face. After Byrne, Jean had a brief, messy relationship with the boxer Max Baer, who was still technically married. His wife threatened to name Jean in divorce proceedings, which would have been another scandal on top of the one she'd just survived. Then, in 1933, the studio essentially arranged for John to marry a cameraman named Harold Rawson. It was widely understood that the marriage was more about deflecting attention from the Baer situation than about any real romance. It lasted about 8 months before they divorced. Jean was 22 years old and already on her 3rd marriage, 3 marriages and a dead husband by the time most people are finishing college. And then she met William Powell. Powell was a huge star, charming and sophisticated, best known for the Thin Man movies. He was older, he was funny, and by all accounts he and Jean genuinely, deeply loved each other. They started seeing each other around 1935, and for the first time in her whole chaotic life, Jean seemed truly happy. Powell gave her a massive 152-carat star sapphire ring, the biggest one worn by any actress in Hollywood. Star sapphires were fashionable in that era, and the actresses all competed over who had the most impressive one. Jean's was legendary. They talked about getting married. Friends said she lit up around him in a way they'd never seen. But there were complications. Powell was hesitant to commit fully. Some people said that was just his personality. Others blamed Mama Jean, who was still very much controlling aspects of Jean's life and finances. Mama Jean handled all of Jean's fan mail, signed her autographs for her, managed her money, and lived in the same house. Even at the height of her stardom, Jean still lived with her mother. She never really broke free. And the studio had opinions about everything their stars did, including who they married and when. So the engagement dragged on, month after month, with Jean hoping they'd eventually set a date and start the family she'd always wanted. There are even reports that Jean became pregnant with Powell's child at some point during their relationship, but the pregnancy didn't continue, either because of Powell's objection or pressure from her mother. If that's true, it adds another layer of heartbreak to a life that was already full of it. Meanwhile, Jean's health was quietly falling apart, and so was her emotional state. Friends who knew her well said she was drinking more and more. The actress Jane Russell, who knew Jean personally, later said she had become a sad girl, driven by her mother, in love with a man who wouldn't marry her, and drinking too much. And the drinking was making things worse in ways nobody understood at the time. Alcohol is one of the worst things for damaged kidneys, and Jean's kidneys were already barely functioning. Every drink was accelerating a process that was already well underway. She was exhausted all the time, not just normal tired from long days on set, but a deep, heavy fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. She caught the flu more often than seemed right. In January 1937, she traveled to Washington, D.C. with actor Robert Taylor for President Roosevelt's birthday fundraiser. She'd campaigned for Roosevelt the year before and was proud of her political involvement. But the trip wiped her out physically. She came back exhausted and sick. Then she'd had a terrible reaction after getting her wisdom teeth pulled that turned into a serious infection and hospitalized her for weeks. At the 1936 Academy Awards, she got so sick during the ceremony that her friend Carole Lombard had to walk her to the bathroom and help her clean up. She'd also had a terrible sunburn at one point that wouldn't heal properly, which we now know is another sign that the kidneys aren't working right. Her skin had taken on a grayish color that makeup could only partly hide. She was gaining weight even though she was constantly dieting. Her hair was thinning so badly that she'd started wearing wigs. But nobody connected any of these things. Nobody thought back to the scarlet fever she'd had at 15. All the symptoms were right there. But the understanding of kidney disease in the 1930s just wasn't advanced enough. The weight she was fighting wasn't fat. It was fluid her kidneys couldn't get rid of. The exhaustion wasn't emotional. It was toxins building up in her blood. The gray skin, the constant illness, the swelling. All of it was pointing at one thing, and nobody could see it. In the spring of 1937, Jean started filming Saratoga with Clark Gable. Gable was probably her closest friend in all of Hollywood. Everyone at the studio called her the baby, but Gable always called her sis. They'd made 6 movies together and had this easy, natural warmth between them that audiences couldn't get enough of. But from almost the first day of shooting, something was clearly wrong with Jean. She couldn't walk from her dressing room to the set without help. She was so weak she had to be driven in a car across the studio lot. She was bloated, exhausted, and struggling to breathe. There's a scene in the movie where Gable has to pick her up and lift her onto the upper berth of a train sleeping car. When he did it, he could feel that she was much heavier than expected, and she was sweating so much and breathing so hard that they had to stop filming. On May 20th, 1937, Jean collapsed on set. A studio doctor examined her and sent her home. Everyone figured it was the flu again, maybe a gallbladder problem. Her personal doctor came and diagnosed an inflamed gallbladder. Nurses were brought in around the clock. She was given fluids and medication. Her mother moved into her room and barely left her side. Now, there's a story that's been told for almost 90 years that says Jean's mother, who followed Christian Science, refused to let real doctors treat her daughter and relied on prayer instead. For decades, people believed Mama Jean essentially let her daughter die because of her religious beliefs. But when researchers actually dug into the records, the picture was more complicated than that. Jean did have doctors. She did have nurses. She was getting blood tests, injections, medication. Mama Jean may have turned away one specific doctor, the studio's physician, but that seems to have been because that particular doctor had betrayed Jean's trust years earlier during the Paul Byrne mess, not because of religion. When Mama Jean was unhappy with Dr. Fishbaugh's diagnosis, she actually brought in a second doctor who correctly identified what was happening. But the real point is that none of it mattered. Even if Jean had been rushed to the best hospital in the world on the very first day she felt sick, nobody could have saved her. In 1937, there was no dialysis. There were no kidney transplants. There weren't even the right antibiotics. When your kidneys gave out in 1937, you died. That was just how it was. For about a week, Jean stayed home while the press got confusing reports. One day she was improving. The next day, headlines screamed that she was seriously ill. Clark Gable came to visit, and what he saw shook him badly. Jean was severely swollen, almost unrecognizable, and when he leaned in to kiss her, there was a strong, unusual odor on her breath that alarmed him. That's what happens when the kidneys completely shut down. The body has to get rid of waste somehow, so it pushes it out through the lungs. That smell told the whole story. Gable mentioned it to the doctors, and everything shifted. The second doctor, Chapman, realized immediately that this wasn't a gallbladder problem at all. Jean was in the final stages of kidney failure. There was nothing to be done. On June 6th, Jean told William Powell that she couldn't see him properly. She couldn't make out how many fingers he was holding up. Her vision was going. That evening, she was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles, where she slipped into a coma. Powell stayed at the hospital. Gable came. Her mother was there. One of the last things Jean had done was remind a nurse to pack her copy of Gone with the Wind. She'd been trying to read it for weeks but could never get past the first few pages because she was too sick to concentrate. The nurse took the book, looked at how bad Jean really was, and said quietly to someone later, "She'll never finish it." The next morning, June 7, 1937, at 11:37 a.m., Jean Harlow died. She was 26 years old. The news hit Hollywood like nothing before it. Spencer Tracy wrote in his diary that day, "Jean Harlow died today. Grand girl." One of the writers at MGM said that the day the baby died, there wasn't a single sound in the studio commissary for 3 hours. Nobody spoke. Nobody ate. The whole lot went silent. MGM shut down entirely for the funeral. She was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, in a private room of multicolored marble that William Powell paid $25,000 for. She was laid to rest in the pink nightgown she'd worn in Saratoga. In her hands, they placed a single white gardenia and a handwritten note from Powell that read, "Good night, my dearest darling." The inscription on her grave says simply, "Our baby." Powell reserved spaces in that same room for himself and for Jean's mother. Mama Jean was buried there in 1958, but Powell remarried in 1940, and when he died in 1984, he was cremated and buried somewhere else entirely. Then there was the movie. Saratoga was almost finished, with about a week of shooting left. MGM talked about replacing Jean with another actress, maybe Jean Arthur or Virginia Bruce. But the public protested so loudly that the studio finished the film using stand-ins. Mary Dees handled close-up shots, always filmed from behind. Another woman did long shots. A third dubbed the remaining lines. Gable later said that finishing the movie felt like holding a ghost. When Saratoga hit theaters in late July 1937, less than 2 months after Jean's death, audiences packed every showing. It became the highest-grossing film of the year and the biggest hit of Jean's entire career. People weren't just watching a movie, they were saying goodbye. The day of John's funeral, MGM shut down completely. Only about 250 people were allowed inside the chapel, but the crowds outside were enormous. Nelson Eddy sang at the service. The pallbearers included some of the biggest names in Hollywood. Jean's entire estate, valued at over $1 million, was left to her mother. Every cent of it. Even in death, Mama Jean got what she wanted. After her death, rumors flew in every direction. The hair bleach killed her. The drinking killed her. Her mother's religion killed her. The studio killed her. But decades later, when her medical records were finally opened, the answer turned out to be simpler and sadder than all the gossip. The scarlet fever at 15 had triggered a slow reaction that gradually destroyed her kidneys over more than 10 years. All those years of exhaustion, the weight she couldn't control, the constant sickness, the gray skin, the mood changes, all of it was her body quietly poisoning itself because her kidneys couldn't do their job anymore. And the cruelest part is that today, what killed Jean Harlow is completely preventable. A kid who gets scarlet fever now takes a basic round of medicine, and the kidney damage never starts. And even if someone's kidneys do fail, there's dialysis, there are transplants, there are real options. Jean Harlow died of something that wouldn't even require a hospital stay to prevent in the 21st century. But in 1937, there was absolutely nothing anyone could do. She was in movies for about 9 years. She made 36 films. She went from a nobody extra making $7 a day to one of the most famous women alive. In May 1937, just weeks before she died, she became the first movie actress to appear on the cover of Life magazine. She was photographed looking radiant, glamorous, alive. Nobody looking at that cover would have guessed she had weeks to live. She wrote a novel during a salary dispute with MGM because she wanted people to know there was more to her than the image. The people who worked with her adored her. Marilyn Monroe, who came along 20 years later and walked a road that Jean had basically built, considered Harlow her hero. Monroe studied Jean's films, copied elements of her style, and saw herself as carrying on something that Jean had started. She was once offered the chance to play Jean in a biographical picture. She read the script, turned it down, and reportedly said, "I hope they don't do that to me after I'm gone." As it turned out, Monroe's own life would end in ways that echoed Jean's, young, sudden, and surrounded by rumors that never got properly answered. The parallels between the two women are hard to ignore. Jean Harlow never got to marry William Powell. She never got to have the children she'd wanted since she was a girl in Kansas City. She never got to grow old enough to step away from all of it and just be herself. The quiet kid everyone called the baby, who loved dogs so much that when the famous movie dog Rin Tin Tin died across the street from her house, she went over and cradled his head in her lap as he passed. She was the kind of person who did things like that. She was gentle in ways that her screen image never showed. She was 26 years old. She'd been in the movie business for about 9 years. In that time, she made 36 films, survived a husband's mysterious death, endured 3 failed marriages, fought a controlling mother who never let go, and built a career that changed what Hollywood looked like forever. And all the while, her body was quietly shutting down from something that had started when she was a teenager. Something that nobody in 1937 had the tools to see or the medicine to fix. What she got was 26 years and a legacy that's lasted almost a century. Every blonde bombshell, every Hollywood icon of glamour, every actress who plays the funny, sharp, beautiful woman on screen is working in a space that Jean Harlow created first. She was the original, and almost 90 years after her death, she's still the one everyone gets measured against. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can enjoy more beautiful stories like this.